Let's take our first question, shall we? Which is from Rosemary Davey.
Yesterday's Gaza ceasefire debate descended into procedural chaos. Are MPs more interested in political point scoring than a life-saving decision?
So how did it appear to you, Rosemary, since you're asking this question?
I think that it was such an important decision to be made. I mean, there are thousands of people being killed every day in Gaza. And it just appeared to me that it was a politically motivated point of procedure. And it completely made the mockery of the debate. It isn't clear what the result of the debate was. And I just think that the UK Parliament didn't do itself any service.
Stella, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do, Rosemary. And I want to start, and I think I probably speak for Laura as well, in saying this did not cover any of us in glory. This is not what any of us came into politics for. You are absolutely right. This is an incredibly serious, sensitive issue. It's very complicated. There's lots of different factors to it. And I think last night it looks like we lost sight of what really matters. And that matters because it means that you lose confidence in the decisions that we were making.
So why did you... I've heard MPs all day saying, this does not reflect well on us, but each one has been blaming all the other parties on their own. So why did you do it? And I'll ask the same of Laura.
Yeah, and I'm not going to mudsling or point score about all of this because it is too important. And I sit here as somebody who actually took quite a bit of hope in the end out of the situation, because in November I voted to support a ceasefire. And actually last night what became very apparent is there was a consensus across the House that people feel that the UK should be joining in the calls for a cease to the violence, for intervention, that actually what might be about to happen in Rafah is completely wrong and not going to help. And I also sit here, if you take one name away from you, Aded Lifshitz is an 84-year-old Jewish man who's being held by Hamas. He used to drive Gazans to the hospital across the border. His daughter is my constituent. She wants a ceasefire. There is much more agreement on the ground in Israel and in Gaza that what is happening is not right. And actually what you saw in Parliament last night was a lot of people who want to find a way through that. So the fact that's not come out of this, that's on us. And I take my responsibility and accountability in that process as well, because it means that on other difficult, complicated issues, you're going to lose faith in our capacity to find a way through. It's really easy in public life to find somebody to shout at, isn't it? But actually, politics shouldn't be just about can we shout at somebody because you're cross with them, because does that move things forward? And the saddest thing about last night is actually that probably did move the debate forward. It probably does give a clear steer to the government about the kind of conversations we want them to be part of. That is not the conversation we're having today, and I understand why we're not having that today, but that, I think, is the conversation we would all really like to have, isn't it? Is what do we do next to help stop the violence, get the hostages home, get the aid in, and get the two-state solution that we know is the only future for Israel and Palestine.
Laura. So Rosemary certainly found it a deeply unedifying spectacle yesterday. Did it show that MPs are more interested in political point scoring than a life-saving decision?
No, and I agree with Rosemary that this subject is too important and it is too sensitive to be kicked around like a political football.
So was there no element of that yesterday as far as... I mean, for example, you could level this at all the parties, the SNP, Labour and the Conservatives, but since you're here representing the government, when the government decided to stick in an amendment the day before the vote, was that not political point? Was that not playing politics?
Well, look, there were sort of elements of the wording that none of the three main parties agreed on. That's why there were amendments. And you'll know that it ended with the irregular outcome of the Speaker apologising to the House. And I want to be completely clear, I'm not laying into Lindsay Hoyle at all. He is a very, very decent person. In fact, he has done a huge amount to restore the reputation of the Speaker's chair since he's been in office. He said last night, I think he made a mistake. And actually, in politics, we go at each other the whole time. sometimes in a way that is toxic and unhealthy, and I think that this should be put behind us. I agree with Stella. If you listen to the substance of the debate, particularly the opening remarks from the government minister and the shadow foreign secretary, it was overwhelming how much consensus there was.
So were the Conservatives right to say, well, actually, we're not going to take part in this anymore, we're going to walk out, which is what happened?
Well, look,
then the whole thing all went into array.
It unravelled. I accept
and
that.
What was Penny Mordaunt right to say, we're not going to take part in this and to walk out?
Because I almost lost track of what the procedural issues were.
But
there were
is
three,
what happened.
There were three
was she right to do that?
There were 3 amendments. It impeded the SNP from putting theirs forward. I may not even be saying it quite correctly. Somebody can jump in. But what happened was not a sort of resolution of the issue. Penny raised a perfectly proper procedural point.
So she was right to walk out then?
Look, as I say...
And so for the government to withdraw from the whole thing completely?
The Speaker made the unusual decision to apologise, and you can... I'm not going for him at all.
No,
but that's how the evening ended. But I think just going back to where there were points of agreement, there was an agreement that there was an immediate need to stop fighting, to get the hostages out as an imperative, to get rapid and unimpeded aid into Gaza. And actually, if you look at what David Cameron has been doing and saying publicly, talking about a two-state solution, not as some sort of abstract, but actually meaningfully what that would look like in terms of the governance of Palestine, the rebuilding of Gaza, the rights and responsibilities of the two sides. And I hope you'll at least consider that, actually, in assessing how seriously this is taken by parliamentarians. OK, well, let's hear from some of our audience. Yes, the woman there with the hand up, yes.
There's a genocide, so why is it so difficult for Britain to vote for a ceasefire when other countries have, other than USA?
Now, when you say genocide, I should say that's a term that's being considered by the International Court of Justice in The Hague at the moment. They haven't ruled on it yet, but they think it's worth further investigation,
there are children
as I'm sure you know.
that are dying of starvation now.
I'll take some more points as well, if that's all right, and we'll come back to your point. Yes, the man there in the black jacket, yeah.
I think we've got to take account of the fact that the vote itself wouldn't have made any difference to the situation on the ground. That doesn't mean that it is not an important vote. I think it is important for Parliament to speak and to tell the world what we think and what we stand for. What I found really strange is that given the tension and the pressure that some of the MPs have been under when, there are protests, near people's houses or in front of people's houses, people are being hounded on social media for their views and their stands. I would have thought that the one thing that Parliament would do, or the MPs would do for themselves, is to try and protect themselves by finding a consensus position that doesn't divide the parties, sort of pitch one against the other. Because at the moment, it looks as if the government is on one side, and then we've got the SNP on the other side, and Labour somewhere in the middle trying to find a way that pleases all their parliamentarians. And I don't think it is going to work. We need to take the heat out of the situation. It is going too far. And I think we don't have to wait until something bad happens to an MP for us to say, actually, we need to dial down the tension.
I mean, you make a really interesting point, and dialing down the tension was the antithesis of what happened yesterday, Camilla.
And obviously, when Sir Lindsay Hoyle tried to explain why he had done what he did, he was saying that he wanted to ensure sort of MP security, because, as you say, sir, there have been these situations where we've had quite aggressive protesters outside MPs' houses and offices, which I don't think is justified at all, regardless of the horror of the circumstances in the Middle East. And actually, my problem with how things panned out yesterday is that effectively House procedures and conventions were changed in response to an angry mob. Where does that actually end?
Should we just explain that for Camilla, just for people who aren't necessarily completely all over this subject? What the Speaker of the House decided to do yesterday was allow basically 3 debates on 2 amendments and a motion, so that the Conservatives would be able to debate their suggestion, Labour would be able to debate their suggestion, the SNP their suggestion, all slightly different wordings about a ceasefire or humanitarian pause. And it's unusual to have a Conservative... If there's a Conservative and a Labour one, the Conservatives are in government, usually the Labour one would fall by the wayside. Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, decided to allow all 3. He said afterwards, because he was mindful of the fact that MPs had been threatened and he wanted everyone to be able to debate. Some people have questioned if that's actually why he made that decision, but that is what he's saying, and he apologised for that. Sorry, Camilla, I just thought I should explain that, because it's all procedural, it's all pretty complicated, but that's basically it.
But surely, I mean, in public life, in a democratic country, if an MP doesn't support a ceasefire for their own reasons, perhaps because they think that a ceasefire now isn't the right time, or that they want to wait for Hamas to down their weapons, or they're making the argument that they think that the hostages need to be released in order to dampen down what's happening, they are entitled to have that opinion without feeling threatened by members of the public. You know, this idea that
but given
you've
that
got
some
the
of them
wrong
have
opinions,
felt threatened, and some have been threatened, many MPs have been threatened, was Lindsay Hoyle right, irrespective of whether you think he was right to allow all three debates or not? Was he right to take that into account? I mean, the Prime Minister today has said, actually, we have to be able to debate this without fear or favour, irrespective of the danger to MPs.
And that's the point. I think that Lindsay did it with the very best of intentions, because I think he is an honest and decent man who does care deeply about MP security, and he's got a legacy of very much caring about it. However, when does that end? You know, because actually you're then dispensing with the traditions of the House, you're dispensing with the advice of the clerks because you're trying to appease an angry mob. So it's an angry mob at the moment about Gaza. In a few weeks' time, it could be an angry mob about the environment, and apparently some MPs have the wrong opinions that then opens them up to threatening behaviour and even death threats. You know, when does that end? I think, you know, the House of Commons has to be a chamber of open and honest debate. And people can express their opinions without facing abject abuse. I mean, it's a free country. And actually, some people don't support the ceasefire now. That doesn't make them bad or wrong. It just makes them in agreement or not in agreement with others.
OK. Man in the blue top.
Yes, I don't think, excuse me, I don't think Lindsay Hoyle was correct in his decision. It was a breach of parliamentary convention, constitutional convention. And where does it stop in terms of the convention? But going back to the big issue, the question is this. There is only one player in the Middle East at the moment, and that's the United States of America. I'm just wondering if parliamentarians are kidding themselves that they've got any influence on the Middle East. The only person who has an influence on what goes on in the Middle East outside the parties is President Joe Biden and the United States administration.
So do you think it's a waste of time MPs debating it at all?
I think they're just getting flustered over nothing. I don't think they have to have an opinion, but the days of the British mandate are over. And I think, you know, ultimately, the only player in the Middle East is the United States, as you can see from Anthony Blinken's trips to the US. David Cameron's made a couple of trips, but Blinken's there all the time. Okay. And that's the difference of superpower politics. Okay.
The woman in the glasses there towards the middle.
One question that we've glossed over, Fiona, I think you asked earlier, was Penny Mordaunt right to walk out of Parliament yesterday?
Yes, I didn't get an answer to that, actually. Don't know if you noticed.
My personal view, I did. My personal view is no. You don't walk out on something that's this important. There are procedural matters, you debate them, you discuss them. That's what she's there for as a representative member of Parliament. Walking out is really disrespectful of all their other colleagues in Parliament and us as their constituents.
Do you want to answer that, Laura?
Well, it wasn't walking out from the discussion itself. It was because three...
Well, it did. I mean, the debates didn't happen after that. I mean, when she
But the debate
out...
was already concluded. The point was because 3 amendments had been selected in this irregular way. It wasn't Parliament ducking its obligations. It was a very irregular night that ended up a mess. I make that admission immediately, and I've said already that I don't think that it reflected the sensitivity and importance, but it wasn't because she was ducking the issue, it was because of the sort of mess, the procedural mess that had unfolded.
Jason?
I think it's a difficult situation. I think the most important thing, which seems to be lost within this parliamentary discourse, is the preservation of human life and peace. And I think what has happened with this political football, actually, no one's come out of it looking well. And seldom do we actually see parliamentarians be contrite about some of their behaviours in the chamber. I think what we've observed with Sir Lindsay Hoyle is there has been contrition. You know, he made a mistake. And I think given his pretty exemplary record in terms of in the House, I do think he needs to be given the benefit of doubt, and we actually need to focus on the work that needs to be done. And the work that needs to be done is to really coalesce, or for parliamentarians to coalesce, around a permanent ceasefire that really recognises the sanctity of preserving the kind of human condition.
OK. Woman here in the green top.
I think the point made about the threats to sharing your opinion is a very good one, because it's delaying procedures, it's delaying any decision being made. I mean, think about amongst your peer groups, you cannot say what your opinion on this is. It's impossible. How on earth politicians can't say anything, because then they're told they have to leave their position, or dependent on which way they fall. So I just think we need to be able to say what our opinion is on this matter to actually move forward and for something to be done, because at the moment we're still in gridlock. We're not doing anything, and we need to.
That's interesting you should say that, because both you, Laura, and you, Stella, have had a serious harassment to the point where people have either had suspended prison sentences or have been, gone to prison. You've both had people convicted because of harassment that you have received. So how do you, as MPs, feel free to be able to voice your opinions on Gaza or anything else without worrying that protests are going to turn up at your house, it may be your children in the house? I mean, how do you manage that?
Well, look, it's kind of the answer to the gentleman's question there. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. But there is something really precious and important about our British political system that's not like the American system, where actually we live in our... I love Walthamstow. If you've not been to Walthamstow, come visit. It's an amazing place. And I love being part of my community. I love the fact that people stop me. They have strong opinions. We do argue, we do disagree. I don't want to live in a bubble disconnected from my community. I think it's really important to the work that we do.
But does it ever make you think twice about what you're saying in the House of Commons?
No, because otherwise you're not doing your job. But it doesn't mean it's easy. And I do think, look, frankly, we all owe it to change and challenge this culture, the press included, as well as the people who take part. Because you're right, it's not just in Parliament people feel they can't have a conversation anymore. And, you know, we do need to have more nuance. The gentleman is right. It's not that a vote in the UK Parliament would change anything directly. What I think all of us had hoped was that it would give a clear steer to the Foreign Secretary in the conversations he's having with our international partners about the sorts of issues and the sorts of pressure we could bring to bear in our relationships and our conversations, not just, frankly, with Israel, but also with the Qataris who have a relationship with Hamas, because ultimately I hope none of us came into politics just to shout at each other. We did come in to make progress on the causes that we care about and to represent the communities that we care about. That is missing from this debate. It's not just about Gaza. Of course people feel strongly. You cannot see what is going on there. You cannot feel the anger. I see rising anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in my beloved community because of this issue. But we've also got people who care passionately about abortion who come and cross those lines as well. We've got people who care passionately about climate change. This isn't about individual issues. This is about how we are now conducting our politics. And all of us have to change that.
So, Laura, let me ask you then. I mean, this is because you, as I say, you've been the subject of harassment as well. Yeah. Very serious harassment. Is this something that gives you pause when you're speaking in the House of Commons, or are other MPs talking to you about how they are becoming wary of what they might say for fear of repercussions outside the House of Commons?
I'm aware of other MPs who have experienced serious harassment around this issue. That wasn't my experience. Like Stella, I actually respect and appreciate robust challenge from my constituents, and on certain issues they've developed my thinking, and I think it should be like that. I think the relationship at times between MP and constituent should be quite symbiotic. There's nothing wrong with that. But this is a country where ultimately we settle our differences at the ballot box. And elected members of Parliament must be allowed to go about and represent in the way they think is appropriate without being frightened from doing so. Otherwise, you just drive down the quality of people who are willing to put themselves forward to stand for office. But can I just say one thing in response to the gentleman up there? I think there were two questions where people said, well, what does it matter? Who cares what happens here? But in a way, what happened last night in microcosm shows that it mattered to parliamentarians, although it was a clumsy way of expressing it. It mattered what was happening to the people who were out on the street outside Parliament. And actually...
Well, hang on, Laura. You're not denying there was a bit of politicking going on as well.
Well, yes, but this issue does matter, and it's important it doesn't poison our discourse. I don't accept that we're irrelevant. Actually, I think having a former Prime Minister as our Foreign Secretary gives us extra kind of clout on the world stage. He had an audience with Netanyahu, a private one, about 2 weeks ago. You're right, I think, to mention Anthony Blinken, but apart from him, is there any other Foreign Secretary who would get that kind of access and represent us well? So actually, I think that we are well represented, and I think these issues do matter.
OK. All right. I'm going to move on. I'm sure, I don't want to disappoint those of you who had your hands up, we will come back to this subject time and time again, and quite rightly.